The 2010s was a really hard decade for action cartoons to find success. It was a period of time filled with many amazingly high-quality action shows that were cut short before realizing their full potential. There were just so many action cartoons that were cancelled during this time. One such action show from this period was Beware the Batman. It was kinda polarizing when it first aired, and there's people who don't like it to this day, but in my opinion, it's a very underrated animated series, despite it still being a somewhat flawed show. It had a lot of potential, and it was already steadily improving, because the few episodes we got were getting progressively better and better the more the plot moved forward, and the show was cancelled before we could see everything that it was setting up. The show caused controversy before it had even started to air. When they revealed the first promotional images for the show, a lot of fans were complaining about the weird looking art style, the use of CG animation, and also the choice to have Batman facing against enemies that weren't his typical villains like Professor Pig and Anarchy, as well as working with allies that weren't his typical sidekicks, with an Earth One inspired Alfred who was more involved with the action, and also Katana. In my opinion, all of this fan backlash could have been mostly avoided if instead of calling the show Beware the Batman, it was simply called Batman and the Outsiders. If they would have marketed the show as a story about Batman forming a group of lesser-known heroes, then I believe that most people would have given the show more of a chance, because it would have been clear that the series was going to try something new, and people wouldn't have compared it so much with all the previous Batman shows we've had. Besides, in the promotional art itself, they were already promoting the fact that both Katana and Metamorpho were going to appear on the show, and while they never mentioned the Outsiders, it was completely obvious that the show was going to focus on them. So to me, it would have been much more appropriate if they had just called it Batman and the Outsiders from the start, and if it was already pretty clear that the Outsiders were going to be a part of the show even before it started airing. Once it actually premiered, it was all even more obvious as the episodes progressed, given that the show was slowly introducing different characters who served as allies to Batman, such as Metamorpho, Man-Bat, and Barbara Gordon as Oracle. Considering all this, it's clear that the show was heading towards the formation of the Outsiders, and even though the series was cancelled before we got to see all they had planned, a few years back, we actually got to see this concept art, which was made and shared by one of the show's creators, Glenn Murakami, on his Instagram page, and the concept shows what would have been the Outsiders lineup that we would have gotten to see in the series. The lineup included characters that we had already been introduced to, like Man-Bat and Metamorpho, but it also included other characters that hadn't appeared yet, such as Cyborg and Red Arrow. Besides that, the concept art confirms that we would have seen some interesting new takes on some characters, since Katana would have become this world's Nightwing, and Barbara Gordon would have adopted the identity of Robin. These are definitely some out there ideas. There are some characters in the lineup who've never been a part of the Outsiders and the comics, and of course, those aren't exactly the Nightwing and Robin that you would normally expect to see. But I've personally always thought that there are generally no bad ideas when writing a story. It all depends on the execution of the idea. So even though the concept of Katana as Nightwing and Barbara Gordon as Robin might seem unappealing, if the writing was good, then the concepts could totally have worked. That's why personally, I really would have liked to see the show continue, and see the payoff of all the build-up that they were doing to introduce the Outsiders. And I might just be speculating here, but another outsider who wasn't directly teased on the show, and yet who also might have appeared, is Black Lightning, since while he wasn't hinted at, we did get to see a villain of his from the comics, Tobias Whale, so given that the two characters are linked and Black Lightning is an OG outsider from the comics, it's totally possible that he could have appeared on the show. We do have evidence for other characters who might have appeared on the show, and while Beware the Batman is kinda infamous for being the show that didn't use Batman's traditional rogues gallery, if they had more seasons, we were going to see more popular villains show up. Some early concept art for the series production shows this design for a character with no name that looks really close to the Joker, and that's because he's most likely the Joker in Beware the Batman's art style, and he looks good in my opinion. I don't know if he would have appeared in a possible season 2, but I think it would have been interesting to see how they were going to portray a Joker in a way that differentiates him from this show's Anarchy, since he felt very similar to the Joker. Another traditional villain that was hinted at was the Penguin. We got to briefly see him on a wanted poster in a scene with the GCPD from episode 19 of the show. And if you've watched the series, then you're most likely thinking about Two-Face, given that the second part of season 1 introduced Harvey Dent as Gotham's new district attorney, and it focused on his attempt at stopping Batman and his growing hatred for him. The last few episodes from the show left Harvey scarred, planting the seeds for Two-Face to finally show up in season 2, which, unfortunately, we never got to see. But in these concept arts made prior to the show's release, we do get to see Two-Face's design and how he would have looked like in the show's style. I just think it's unfair whenever a show spends so much time setting up a promising storyline which never gets resolved, and Beware the Batman has a lot of that. It's a show that was obviously heading towards The Outsiders ever since it was announced, but it never got the chance to adapt them. It's a show that was criticized for using unpopular villains and trying new things, and while there were some flaws in their execution, it still never got the time to craft a unique identity as a series, distinct from previous Batman shows, which is also why I said that I personally would have called the show Batman and the Outsiders from the start, to separate itself from previous shows. The series just had so much unfulfilled potential. Another cool fact about the show is that it's the first Batman animated series with serialized storytelling. In the past, we've gotten overarching storylines in previous Batman shows like Equinox on The Brave and the Bold, or the downfall of Ethan Bennett as Clayface on The Batman. But those were story arcs played out over certain episodes of an episodic season where most episodes are pretty much self-contained. But in Beware the Batman, it was the first time where we got to see a story arc developing episode by episode. Even though the show still had somewhat of a villain of the week type format, each episode still moved the main plot forward and revealed information on the character's past or made developments to the main storyline, with the first half of the show being focused on Katana's background and the League of Assassins, and the second half of the show dealing with Alfred's past with Deathstroke and Harvey Dent's devolution into Two-Face. There's so much potential in a serialized Batman show, and that's what Beware the Batman was. It had the opportunity to tell stories in a way that no other Batman show attempted to do previously, and I also think it had very visceral action with great choreographies. The Killer Croc fight on the show was awesome, and there's this scene in one episode where Batman's fighting against a couple of thugs and he dislocates his shoulder, to which he slams against a truck and he pops it back in during the middle of the fight. It was so badass. The show was far from perfect. The CG environments looked really bland and empty, and the animation could get somewhat stiff in more dialogue-heavy scenes, and yet it was still improving with each episode though. The first half of the season struggles a bit, but the final episodes that dealt with Ra's al Ghul were really good, and the second half of the season that dealt with Deathstroke and Harvey Dent is legitimately great. The show was starting to find its stride, and I'm pretty sure that it would have gotten even better if it had continued with everything that they were setting up. I mean, 2004's The Batman, for example, is nowadays remembered very fondly, and most people like it, but when it first came out, it was kinda divisive. A lot of fans thought that the show was mediocre when compared to Batman the Animated Series, but later on, as the seasons came out, those opinions eased up a bit. But could you imagine what would have happened if The Batman had only gotten one season and that was it? I bet that the show wouldn't be liked as much as it is today, because the show simply would have never gotten the chance to fully execute its ideas and show its potential. So who knows, maybe Beware the Batman was actually going to be amazing and a really great action cartoon, and we'll never truly know what really could have been.